Hey everyone, in this video I'm going to talk about the next and final round of universalistic metaethical theories, deontology and utilitarianism. Alright, let's begin with deontology. Deontology is the metaethical theory that duty is the basis of morality. Some of the additional key claims of deontology are that moral principles are universal, that's why it's a universalistic theory of ethics. Reason is important in discerning and applying moral principles, which is a common feature in universalistic theories of ethics. Persons cannot be used as means only. I'll talk a little bit more about what that means. I'll talk a little bit more about precisely what that entails in a little bit. And then also, intention or a good will is a means by which to measure moral goodness. The principal founder of deontology is Immanuel Kant, though he wouldn't have called his own view deontology. That's a word that gets invented later. And in his deontology, he really emphasizes the importance of what he calls the categorical imperative. So listen to the words of Immanuel Kant here in the Critique of Practical Reason. With one word, the moral law requires the observance of duty, not from proclivity, which one cannot and must not presuppose. What that means is that the right thing to do depends on what our duty is, whether or not we really want to do it. Now, for Kant, I think it's important to point out how he gets here. Before Kant wrote this book on ethics called Kritik der praktischen Vernunft, or Critique of Practical Reason, he wrote a book called Kritik der reinen Vernunft, or Critique of Pure Reason. And in that Critique of Pure Reason, he shows how there's things that we can know without knowing that we can know them. The technical term for knowing something in this way without knowing that we know it is a synthetic a priori. So in order to explain that, we need to talk about some words. A priori versus a posteriori. A priori means you know it beforehand. A posteriori means you know it after the fact. Prior, posterior. But then he also talks about the distinction between the analytic and the synthetic. Analytic propositions are those propositions where the predicate is contained in the subject. So I say something where I say X is, and then what follows is really almost a synonym for the first thing. For example, a triangle has three sides. As soon as you hear the word triangle, you know what it is and you know what it looks like. And so when I say it has three sides, I'm really reflecting back to the fact that it is a triangle. Saying a triangle has three sides is almost like saying a triangle is a triangle. Then there are also synthetic propositions. Synthetic propositions are not obviously true. Like if I say there's a red car in the parking lot, that's not something that you can know immediately. For synthetic propositions, they're not obviously true. If there's a red car in the parking lot, we kind of need to confirm that by going and looking at the parking lot. It's not something we can just figure out on our own. So Kant says there are these things that we know called synthetic a priori. That is, we know them prior to experience, but somehow they're not true by definition. There are things that we know before we have to go out and do any research, but they're synthetic, that is, they're not true by definition. How could we possibly do this? Now, in the Critique of Pure Reason, he spends a lot of time talking about how our mind works with various kinds of conceptualizations. And consider this as an example. Picture in your mind a cube. Sides here, sides here, sides here. Now listen to this question. How many edges does it have? And by edge, I mean where two planes are coming together. So yeah, it has 6 sides in 3 dimensions, but how many edges does it have? The answer is 12. Probably most of you had to add that up there and figure out, okay, how many edges does it have where that's coming together? But here's the thing that's interesting. That's an example of synthetic a priori, because even though you might have had to do the math there and count up, oh, how many edges does it have? It rendered in your mind already with the 12 edges without you having to program that into your mind. Make this thing. Picture this thing. In short, your mind made it with 12 edges without you even knowing that it had 12 edges. It just did that on automatic. And Kant's point is that our minds do a lot of things on automatic without us really having to tell it to do that. We don't have to program it. We don't have to shift gears. It just does it. Kant's first book spends a lot of time talking about how we do this by looking at shapes and all kinds of other things in space, and the way that our observations and the way our sensory apparatus works. But in the Critique of Practical Reason, he moves on to saying, just like there's stuff that we know without knowing exactly how we know it, but nevertheless it's true. In ethics, for him, morality works the same way. Something like murder is wrong is something that we know, our mind already reaches the conclusion, but we still kind of have to add it up to see exactly why it works. Our mind does it on automatic already, but we can still parse it out to see, yeah, okay, that works. And for Kant, that's how morality works. We just know it using our reason, just like stuff in math. How many sides does a triangle have? 3. Is murder right? No. Those are similar kinds of thinking for Immanuel Kant. And for him, this leads him eventually to the conclusion of what he calls the categorical imperative. Now, a categorical imperative is a term introduced by Immanuel Kant to describe moral injunctions that are unconditionally binding upon us. We must do them. This is different from a hypothetical imperative. A hypothetical imperative is something that you must do if the situation comes up. A categorical imperative is something that we must do in all times, in all situations, and in all circumstances. And for Kant, it has 3 formulations. There are 3 versions of the categorical imperative. The first formulation is act only on that subjective maxim that you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. Basically, this means you should only do something if you would accept everybody doing it. So something that Kant brings up fairly often is lying. Should you tell a lie? Really, you should only accept lying if you'd be okay with everybody lying all the time. Would you want people to lie to you? And if the answer is no, if there's ever an exception, then that can't be the case that that's good, because it would be irrational. In fact, lying is only ever successful because we expect people to tell the truth. So basically, this is a technical way of saying only be okay with doing something if you'd be okay with everybody doing it. The second formulation of the categorical imperative is this: act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never merely as a means to an end, but always at the same time as an end. So what does it mean to treat people as an end? You treat people with dignity in themselves. You don't use people merely as a means. Now, he does say merely here. Do we sometimes use people as means? Do we use people? Yes. If you're at a grocery store and you're checking out, and the cashier is checking out your items for you, you're using them. But you're not merely using them. But to use someone only for their use would be a violation of the categorical imperative. People have intrinsic dignity, and we need to respect that dignity. We should never merely use people. This would seem to be not only an indictment of something like slavery, but an indictment of any kind of abuse of people. And the third formulation says, act according to maxims of a universally legislating member of a merely possible kingdom of ends. This one's probably the one that's the most difficult to figure out just looking at it. My shorthand version is this: humanity is a team sport. Be a team player. Morality and everything else is not something that we do in isolation. It's something that we do together. And the team is humanity. It's not my country. It's not my people. It's my family. It's us together with all rational beings. So we work together to maintain this. It's not something that I merely do by myself. It's not something you do by yourself. It's something that we all do as a kingdom together. Now, Kant, as a deontologist, actually ends up committing himself to what are considered some fairly extreme positions. Should you tell a lie? Never. In fact, he says, if you lie, you annihilate your own dignity as a human being. Well, is it ever appropriate to tell a lie? Consider this, for example, though. Let's say you're living in Germany in World War II. You are helping and protecting Jews from being slaughtered in the Holocaust. The Gestapo shows up at your door and says, do you have any Jews here in this house? Now, it seems like Kant would say you'd have to say yes here to avoid telling a lie. Now, to be fair to Kant, in order to avoid telling a lie, we don't have to say anything. We could really keep our mouths shut. But the idea is that even if something terrible happens after this, Kant would say, that's on them, the people that did the wrong, not on you. You did your job by maintaining your integrity, by maintaining the categorical imperative, and not lying. Is it ever wrong to kill someone? Murder in cold blood is one thing, but what about self-defense? And so on. Now, in order to mitigate the apparent stringency of Kant's categorical imperative, later deontologists have separated duties into different categories. And with these categories in view, we can say that some duties are more important than others. So for Kant, our duty was to the categorical imperative. We must only do something if we'd be okay with everybody doing it. We must never treat people merely as means, but always as ends in themselves, and we must do this collectively as a kingdom of ends. Another deontologist that lived later, W.D. Ross, actually divides duties into separate categories, saying that some categories are more important than others. For example, his base duties are beneficence and non-maleficence. That means our default standard duties are to do good to others and to not do evil to others. We should be good to everybody that we meet, generally speaking, and we shouldn't go around being cruel and mean. Non-maleficence means that we are not evil to people that we come across. Do good, don't do bad to people that you meet. And that's our default position. Then he also has duties based on past obligation. These are things that we sign up for that are situational. They're only duties if we sign up for them. So these include fidelity, reparation, and gratitude. 1. Fidelity. If you make a promise, you're supposed to keep it. Anytime you've ever signed your signature on a credit card slip, that is an example of fidelity. What you're saying is, I claim that I'm going to pay this. I promise to pay this. So basically, fidelity means keep your promises. You don't have to make any promises, but if you do, you should keep them. Also, the next duty is reparation. If you make a mistake, you should own it. You're in the parking lot, you back up into another car, and you just ding another car. The duty of reparation says you didn't sign up for this, but now that you find yourself in this situation where you've made an error and you've caused someone else some harm, make it right. And you have a duty, an obligation to make it right. And then gratitude. We have a duty to be thankful to people that do good to us and go out of their way to do more good to us. We should be thankful. And so when someone does good for us, we shouldn't merely just go, meh, whatever, but be thankful. Thankfulness, gratitude is itself a duty. Someone does something for you, be thankful. You don't have to just be thankful all the time, but if someone goes out of the way to do something for you, you should be thankful. Finally, we have ongoing duties. These aren't merely the starting point, and they're not things that are situational. These are ones that they never stop. For example, with fidelity, you keep a promise, you fulfill your promise, it's done. Ongoing duties keep on going. They never, ever, ever stop. So they are self-improvement and justice. Self-improvement is this: you have a duty to make yourself better. Whether that be with, say, your physical health or your own education, you have a duty to others around you and to yourself to make yourself a better person. For example, if you decide to do something that's injurious to your health, let's say you smoke cigarettes constantly, you're smoking a carton of cigarettes a day. Eventually, that's going to cause harm to you, but not just to you, but to others around you. Your body will decay, and other people are probably going to have to take care of you because of your own mistreatment of your own body. So you have a duty to take care of yourself and to make yourself better, but not just physically. You have a duty to educate yourself. The more you educate yourself, the more you make yourself a better citizen, the better you are a participant in that third formulation of the categorical imperative in the kingdom of ends. And also, we have an ongoing duty towards justice. That means treating people impartially and rectifying wrongs. That doesn't stop. It's not merely based on situations. That's something that we do every day. We treat people justly. Also, deontologists make a big deal about talking about how intention is important. Our goodwill, how we go into a situation, and our attitudes mitigate the goodness of an action. So we know sometimes we can go into a situation with the right reasons and it doesn't turn out well. Did we do the right thing if we have the best intentions? In a deontologist mindset, yes, you did the right thing, even if the consequences don't turn out that way. And so our intention and our will plays a part in determining if we did the right thing or not. And this is why in the Western tradition we have degrees of certain kinds of wrong. For example, on paper, in terms of consequence, there's really no difference between first-degree murder, second-degree murder, and manslaughter. In all three instances, somebody killed somebody else. But in our legal system, we have differences between first-degree murder, second-degree murder, and manslaughter. First-degree murder, you were seeking this person out. I've been wanting to kill them for years. I've been planning it for a long time. They're dead. There is a malevolent intention. You were wanting evil from the beginning. Second-degree murder, on the other hand, is not where there's this cold intention, but it's a crime of passion. You find your significant other has not been faithful to you, so you kill your significant other. It's not something you were planning and seething about for years. It's something that happened in the moment. Still a crime, still wrong, but considered less severe than in the first case. And then there's manslaughter. Somebody offended you, you ended up punching them in the face, you didn't know they had a heart condition, and somehow from you just punching them, not trying to beat them, not trying to kill them, they end up dying as a result. You didn't mean to kill them, you just meant to punch them. But nevertheless, the result was the same, but the punishment here is less severe in manslaughter, despite the fact that manslaughter sounds like it's more severe. Murder versus manslaughter. Manslaughter sounds intense, but it's actually the most benign of these crimes. The end result in all three of those scenarios is identical. Someone killed somebody else. We have degrees of severity, degrees of wrongness, and also associated degrees of punishment with each of those crimes. Manslaughter is not considered as bad as murder in the second degree, which is not considered as bad as murder in the first degree. And the fact that we separate these by intention comes from the deontological tradition. And in the deontological tradition, the intention that we have plays a part in how we determine the rightness or wrongness of an action. Were you trying to do the right thing? If you were, then you did the right thing. Even if the consequences end up not being good. For Kant and classical deontology, you maintain and preserve those categorical ethical principles. So if you find yourself in the situation, say your grandmother is on her deathbed, she's not looking good, and she says to you, "Do I still look beautiful?" And she looks ratchet. The deontologist would have to say here, when grandma asks, "Do I still look beautiful?" you have to go, "Sorry, grandma, you don't. You look pretty bad." Because we have a duty and an obligation to tell the truth, even if it's uncomfortable and difficult and upsetting. Our obligation lies there. So deontology really has this focus on the intent of our actions, our intent. Were we trying to do the right thing? That's what makes something good. Utilitarianism, on the other hand, has quite a different view. So utilitarianism is the view that what is moral is that which produces the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. It's a consequentialist theory of ethics, where deontology was focused on intention and what we're trying to do. Utilitarianism, on the other hand, is focused on the outcome, or what actually happens or occurs. Frankly, in utilitarianism, intentions don't matter. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. What was the result? And we're able to measure the rightness or wrongness of an action based on its results. So here are the key claims of utilitarianism. First off, the utilitarians start with this position. The desire for happiness is self-evident and universal. Now, this kind of sounds like ethical egoism. It's not, but it sounds like it. That we all desire to be happy. Utilitarians take that as a given. Also, like the ethical egoists, pleasure brings about happiness, pain brings about unhappiness. Pleasure good, pain bad. People are naturally sympathetic and concerned with promoting the happiness of others. We like to make other people happy, and we like to make other people happy often because it makes us feel good. Further, an action is morally right to the extent that it promotes the happiness or pleasure of all those affected by it. We can measure goodness by how does it affect the maximum amount of people positively. On the other hand, an action is morally wrong to the extent that it increases unhappiness or pain. And we can actually quantify this stuff. Did you make a bunch of people upset? Did you make a bunch of people unhappy? Did you injure or harm or kill a bunch of people? That's wrong. Even if it makes you really happy. The greatest happiness for the greatest number is what mitigates utilitarian ethics. Furthermore, unlike deontology, where the moral community consists of all rational beings, if there's rational beings out in the universe, beings that have minds, they're the ones that are the moral agents. They're the ones that matter. Utilitarianism, on the other hand, it's common for the moral community to consist of all sentient beings, and the definition for sentience in utilitarian ethics is that a creature can feel pleasure and pain. So a chimpanzee might not be sentient in the sense of having grand intelligence like a human being, but a chimpanzee can feel pleasure and pain, therefore they're part of the moral community. And that's why some utilitarians, like Peter Singer, will say animals, it's not that they have rights, but they're part of the moral community, and we need to consider the feelings, not in the sense of emotions, but feelings in the sense of pleasure and pain of other creatures in the decisions of humanity. What we do affects not just us, but those beings that experience pleasure and pain. Now, the experiences of pleasure and pain might be the result of various features that we can describe in evolutionary biology, but nevertheless, that's where we go when we want to determine what is right or wrong. Does it produce happiness and pleasure? It's good. Does it produce pain and unhappiness? It's bad, even if it has the right intention. Utilitarianism can be split into basically two kinds: rule utilitarianism and act utilitarianism. Rule utilitarianism is the version of utilitarianism that says that actions are moral when they conform to the rules that lead to the greatest good. So we start with some basic principles and we say these are things that we can and cannot do. On the other hand, act utilitarianism is the view that says the right action is the one which produces the greatest amount of happiness or pleasure for the greatest number of beings, period. Whether or not certain rules are violated or not, because those rules are not in place. So, in an extreme example, do you kill one person terribly through some sort of laboratory experiment to cure cancer? The act utilitarian would say, absolutely. What's one person compared to the lives of millions of people? Whereas a rule utilitarian would say, that would be great if we could cure cancer, but there's some things that we can't do. The character of Thanos in the MCU seems like a great example of a utilitarian in that he's willing to snap those fingers and get rid of half of everyone in the universe in order to do what's best for the universe. Seems like an act utilitarian. Because, yeah, are some people going to suffer? Are there going to be people missing? Are people annihilated or killed? Sure, but is it what's best for everyone, generally speaking? Yeah. Now, even though there are antecedents in utilitarianism, that is, there were people before that were developing utilitarian theory like David Hume, Jeremy Bentham is probably the first well-known utilitarian. And one of the things that he did is he came up with a kind of calculus of sorts to figure out is something right or wrong or not. And it's based on the 7 principles that I have on the screen: intensity, duration, certainty, propinquity, fecundity, extent, and purity. You want to know if something's right or wrong or not? Gauge it on these 7 items. Intensity. How strong is the pleasure or pain? Reading a good book is not the same thing as an orgasm. Duration. How long is it going to last? Is this something that's going to feel good for a long time or a short time? Certainty. Do you know it's going to happen? Do you think it's going to happen? It might happen. It may not happen. You can gauge the goodness of something on the likelihood of its occurrence. Propinquity. How far away is it going to be? Propinquity is basically the notion of proximity but in time. Proximity is how physically close something is to me. Propinquity is how temporally close something is to me. So propinquity is this going to happen tonight or is this going to happen 10 years from now? So, for example, when it comes to propinquity, for example, consider propinquity. If I say I'm going to give you $100 right now versus I'm going to give you $100 10 years from now, propinquity plays a part in terms of which we consider is better. Fecundity. Will this lead to more pleasure? Is it fecund? So fecundity is where one thing leads to another. It doesn't just stop, but it goes and it grows. Extent. How many people does this affect? We can measure the goodness of an action by, does this just affect me or a couple of people, my crew, or does this affect many people positively or negatively? That's another aspect of how we can gauge what is right and wrong. And then purity is the degree to which pleasure does not cause simultaneous pain. Something might seem like a good idea at the time. Something might seem great, but then it results in pain or some kind of cost later. So for a pleasure to be pure, it doesn't have pain associated with it. There are all kinds of things that feel good, but have consequences. For example, you getting intoxicated right now might feel awesome, but that purity goes down when you have that hangover tomorrow. Now, while Jeremy Bentham might have been one of the original proponents of utilitarianism, probably the most well-known proponent of utilitarianism, who literally wrote a book called Utilitarianism, is John Stuart Mill, with the help of his wife, Harriet Taylor Mill. With a lot of significant input from his wife, Harriet Taylor Mill, who is a robust utilitarian philosopher in her own right, despite the fact that she doesn't get as much credit as she should. Now, Mill is against the idea of act utilitarianism. He's a rule utilitarian. And so he says, yeah, when it comes to pleasure and pain, for human beings, for higher beings, some things are better than others. In fact, he goes as far as to say, it is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. If the fool or the pig are of a different opinion, it's because they only know their own side of the question. So what Mill wants to do is say that utilitarianism here is not just raw hedonism. That's actually a kind of hedonism. That's actually a kind of selfishness. This is not that Mill wants to stress. We're about what's doing what's best for everyone, not just what feels good to me in the moment. And there are some things which might be considered painful, but for us as human beings are best. Another aspect of Mill's utilitarianism is his libertarianism. Now, when I say libertarianism here, I don't mean libertarianism as in related to the Libertarian Party, but libertarianism in terms of the notion of freedom. In his On Liberty, he says, the object of this essay is to assert one very simple principle. As entitled to govern absolutely the dealings of society with the individual in the way of compulsion and control, whether the means used be physical force or the form of legal penalties or the moral coercion of public opinion. That principle is that the sole end for which mankind are warranted, individually or collectively, in interfering with the liberty or action of any of their number is self-protection. That the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. What Mill is saying here is, in spite of everything that he said about utilitarianism, in spite of the fact that the greatest good for the greatest number, that consequences are more important than intentions, there's this mitigating principle. Someone's not doing what you want them to do, you can't change their mind. You can't force them. People ought to have freedom. The only time you ought violate someone's freedom is if they're causing harm to others. Live and let live. Let people do what they're going to do. But if they're causing harm to others, that's when authority and force can step in and say, nope, you can't do that. He continues, his own good, either physical or moral, is not sufficient warrant. You don't violate people's freedom for what's best for them. Going, well, they need to learn a lesson. They need to do better than this. It's their duty to do so. Mill says, no. Let people do what they want to do. The only time you can step in with violence or force is when they're doing something that is harmful to others. Might be good reason. He says there are good reasons for remonstrating with him, that is correcting someone, or reasoning with him, or persuading him, or entreating him, but not for compelling him or visiting him with any evil, in case he do otherwise. To justify that, the conduct for which it is desired to deter him must be calculated to produce evil to someone else. Only violate someone's right to freedom if they're harming someone else. The only part of conduct for anyone for which he is amenable to society is that which concerns others. In the part which merely concerns himself, his independence of right is absolute. Over himself, over his own body and mind, the individual is sovereign. A person may cause evil to others not only by his actions, but by his inaction, and in either case he is justly accountable to them for the injury. That's important. You can be held accountable not just for what you actually do, but by what you don't do. And so, Mill says, people don't want to play by this game. People want to do whatever they do. Let them. Until and unless they cause harm to others, or are causing harm to others. Do what's the best for most people. But you can't violate people's freedom unless and until they cause harm to others. Right now, I'm thinking of this situation. You don't want to wear a mask? That's your right. But the fact that you could potentially cause harm to others in doing so, that's not right. And that's going to be rectified. For example, in a COVID-19 world, in your freedom, you say, I'm not going to wear a mask. you can do that if you want to. That's your right. You can behave how you want. But in that could cause harm to others. That's not right, and you don't get to make that decision. And other people can step in, including the state, with force to prevent your harm to others, because that is what's best for everyone. Otherwise, live and let live. So that's been a brief summary of deontology and utilitarianism. In the next video, what we're going to do is we're going to look at particular codes of ethics for engineers and see how those are informed by the various metaethical frameworks which we've already previously examined.